Respected members of the United Nations Congress, I thank you for your time. I will be presenting a motion on affirmative action in education for an educational reform for trans and gender non-conforming students in Italy. My name is Alessio Scarito. I am a doctorate candidate at the School of Education of Webster University. During this presentation, I will contextualize the issue. I have prepared 10 points of historical, legal, and social background that I will present and describe with commentary. I will also advance my stance and positionality to then get to the motion proposal proper and all the supporting research that helped informing this proposal. The historical background of the transgender movement in Italy is one that is contiguous to the activist and civil rights movement of the 60s, but it is unfortunately politically weak. We will see that in details why that is the case. So although it has a long history, there is little political representation. Moreover, historically, the gender expectation of Italy have been conservative, and the anti-trans discourse adapts very well to local traditions, to dialects, to costumes. I also would like to mention that since the pandemic, hate crimes, hate speech, and microaggressions have intensified a lot and target trans and queer individuals in a much more significant way since the pandemic. This historical situation is due to some very particular characteristics that are specific to Italy. For example, the transgender movement does not have some unifying symbolic symbols like it happens in the US with the protagonist of, for example, the Stonewall riots. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, they are icons, they are staples, and they are symbolic figures that unify the movement. Unfortunately, there is no such correspondent in Italy, so much so that the first gay movements were actually founded by non-binary individuals, meaning that there is actually not a specificity for the transgender since the very beginning. There is indeed, because of this, a misrepresentation of absence of the queer identities, the gender non-conforming in intertextuality, inside and outside the LGBTQ plus movements. This creates a historical need for a self-preservation, for invisibility, in order to protect themselves from threats, microaggression, and all the other interactions that daily happens and greatly impacts their mental and physical well-being. The legal and political situation is at odds with what the core values of the European Union are. In fact, Italy is lagging behind in terms of bureaucracy, in terms of legislation. For example, the Italian legal system is not recognizing gender self-identification for as grounds to convict for hate crime, hate speech, workplace misconduct, sexual harassment, reproductive rights, etc. Trans folk are treated as dysphoria cases. The pathology has been excluded from the European Union legislations on trans and queer individuals. Therefore, the European Union does not recognize gender dysphoria in cases of gender self-identification. Therefore, there is this legal void that not only regards an individual but also regards queer families, the rights and the very complex bureaucracy that they need to navigate for basic services. Specifically, laws in Italy, we can tell that they are incomplete. Same-sex marriage, for example, is legal. civil couples are recognized, also homosexual couples or queer couples are recognized as a civil union, but there are fewer, if none, bureaucratic ways to go through, for example, adoption or even mortgages and other systemic um, bureaucratic activities that must be done for public life. So bureaucracy becomes a form of gatekeeping for queer individuals, queer families. Must be mentioned as well that European Union also calls for fees in case a state member does not reach the benchmark or does not align with the values. Therefore, Italy is paying annually lots of fees to the European Union because of this. Also, because of this incompleteness of aligning with the values and the legislation supported by the European Union. The current social context is one of internalized homophobia. There are structural inequalities, as we have seen, and this causes a social segregation, marginalization in so many aspects of public lives that also language is included in this debate. Um, Italian language is one that is grammarly gendered. Therefore, it has been very hard for activists and for supporters to promote a gender neutral type of language to refer to gender identities. The language use has become a battleground of ideological sparring because, again, Italy sees themselves as a very conservative, very traditional nation. Therefore, those changes in language do not represent what's the will, the conservative will of the people. So this has a consequence in education that is very important, so that there is an underrepresentation and a misrepresentation of non-binary identities. The misrepresentation comes when there is a discrepancy between a gender identity and the actual documentation that is in the public schools, and the underrepresentation is, of course, for the lack of narratives, materials, and other other ways to use narratives of trans and gender non-conforming individuals as materials for the curriculum. Moreover, it must be said that, of course, we have already mentioned how the pandemic exacerbated this fact, but homophobic hate disproportionately targets trans and gender non-conforming individuals. Indeed, the statistics are that they are 5% of the LGBT plus community, but they get to experience a quarter of the total cases of hate crime, hate speech, aggression, sexual harassment, etc. This is, of course, something that is a consequence of that internalized homophobia that we talked about, and there is a need for the Italian country to conform to the European Union set of values. Unfortunately, that cannot happen until the discourse on anti-gender and anti-LGBTQ rights separates themselves from the political discourse, the linguistic discourse, and does not consider other gender identities as a threat to the culture, the religion, and the morality of the Italian nation. Moving on, I will be describing my stance and positionality on the matter. I have discovered that the best way to promote change is to support, is to advocate, and is to act on issues that disproportionately impact marginalized and vulnerable people. I come from a privileged position where I have the possibility to share research and rediscovered a knowledge that does not pertain to all my intersectional identities, but that are, of course, useful to many other identities and many other intersectionalities in order to advance their own rights. Indeed, trans rights are human rights, and indeed, the same issues of rediscovering and democratizing a knowledge that is not just the white, heteronormative, male, able body type of socialization that prescribes it. So any other knowledge indeed helps for change, for social progress, and for civil rights of many, many more intersectional identities. Here we are at the motion. I present this motion supported by all these points of historical, legal, and social context to require the elimination of systemic barriers to education for trans and gender non-conforming citizens, students in Italy. We have seen how those barriers are historical, they are cultural, and they do, rather than being the following a knowledge that promotes scientific advancements and an understanding of what is gender violence and gender variability. The changes will have the ultimate objective to guarantee equitable access to education for all trans and gender non-conforming students, to ensure that no physical and psychological harm is caused by systemic barriers, cultural assumptions, and linguistics short circuits of the language, to guarantee that the identities, not the trans and queer identities, are not erased in the process of education, and to equip trans and gender non-conforming students, as well as all students, with the means to critique and redefine the society they live in. In details, here is what the reform should contain. It should contain changes that pertain to legal, medical, policy, and school proper reforms. So, in terms of the legal language, gender self-determination should be introduced, so that there is no discrepancy between a gender identification and a documentation in a public school. This, of course, goes to demonstrate that it can streamline the educational process. To standardize the non-binary options in official documents. For example, the standardization of parent one and parent two, the standardization of exactly genders as a non-binary option to be included, so that there is less and less discrepancy. An implementation of a consistent linguistic framework, not only for the grammatical aspects, but also for the vocabulary, so that more gender identities can recognize themselves into the various linguistic, in the various vocabulary that is included. In the medical part, we should eliminate a mandatory psychiatric diagnosis, which is a pathologization, as that is a prerequisite for for gender affirming care. It's something that does not adhere with EU standards, and it's something that will need a bigger medical reform. But as soon as we can reform the medical language of school, of the school, we can understand. We can hope that gender self-identification does not. There is not the prerequisite of getting a diagnosis of gender dysphoria or any other pathology or mental instability that the medical practice still in Italy has. Therefore, we need also to establish an infrastructure for accountability against abuse and gatekeeping. The medical, the bureaucracy, they do. They can use that as gatekeeping for advancement in gender affirming care, mental support, as well as advancement, bureaucratic advancements in education for transitions from elementary to middle and to high school and to higher education, etc. The policy reforms should concentrate on removing these structural barriers, and therefore, as we have mentioned in points 1 and 2, those are the beginning to do that, to include gender-based discrimination as ground for bullying, cyberbullying, hate crime, hate speech in the school property and in campuses, to recognize gender self-identification as factor of intersectional marginalization, so to acknowledge that intersectionality also passes through sex and gender and gender identification. So those identities do compound to intersect with other structural barriers for the trans and queer and gender non-conforming students in Italy. Therefore, to align with the EU guidelines in order to avoid the fees too, but that's also, as we can see, more an ideological issue right now. Some more reforms in the educational and school side of this has to do with reforming the national curricula, of course, to include gender education on gender diversity that is age appropriate. So to start either with preschool or kindergarten with an age appropriate education on sex and gender. To standardize all the forms, records, and database to reflect the chosen names and pronouns. This is something that we have just mentioned, but indeed, that does not only have to involve the official documents, the bureaucratic papers, but also other aspects of life. For example, bathrooms, gym lockers, participation to sports, school events, etc. Here I want to continue with this just to share how much of the research, how much research exists on this point. The research on the Italian case is actually pretty hefty, pretty rich. And again, all of these authors have helped me to inform all the points. For example, for point 1, we have understood that gender self-identification is a criterion that eliminates gatekeepers. The use of gender neutral language in Italy has been linked to positive outcomes in trans and queer individuals' public life. For example, social affirmation, individual self-affirmation, and social recognition. We see how the pathologization of gender it reflects a cultural assumption, not the scientific knowledge. Therefore, gender affirming care has not been appropriate. So, appropriate gender care and gender affirming care and appropriate mental support, those are linked to positive psychological functioning that, of course, will have positive repercussions in education. On the case of the more policy-related things, we have understood that as soon as the policy does protect and there is authenticity and awareness of how all these cultural assumptions and internalized homophobia play, there is, of course, positive outcomes. Of course, it also helps with criticality of the systemic oppressions that are at play. Italy, as we mentioned, lacks so many laws on sexual education. There is so much need to renegotiate gender identities and to use critical pedagogy approaches in class in order to rediscover personal narratives. Many examples and many activities have been proposed in order to help trans and gender non-conforming students to find their own identities and to historicize and to contextualize gender non-conforming identities. I thank you very much for this time. I yield my time back to the Congress. Thank you very much.